Welcome to The Things That Bother Me, the channel where we talk about the things people feel but are told not to question, the patterns hiding in plain sight, the systems people depend on every day without ever asking who benefits from that dependence in the first place. This series isn't about politics alone. It isn't about left versus right. It's about transformation. Cultural, economic, psychological, and structural transformation happening in real time, slow enough that most people never notice it until the damage is already done. And tonight we're continuing America, the Damage is Permanent, with Episode 7, Dependence Replaced Independence. There was a time when independence wasn't optional. People had to know how to survive, adapt, build, repair, think for themselves, and function without constant support from massive systems. Now, most people can't function for a week without systems they don't control. Food, money, communication, transportation, information. Everything routed through structures that become more centralized every year. And the dangerous part is this didn't happen through force. It happened through convenience. Piece by piece, comfort replaced resilience. Access replaced capability. Systems replaced self-reliance. And dependence became so normalized that questioning it now sounds extreme. That's what this episode is about. Not nostalgia, not pretending the past was perfect, but understanding how a society built on independence slowly became a society dependent on systems for nearly every aspect of life, and what that means when those systems become unstable, corrupted, or weaponized. Because once dependence becomes permanent, freedom starts becoming conditional, and most people don't even realize it's happening. Let's get into it.
America, the Damage is Permanent, Episode 7. Dependence replaced independence. There was a time when independence wasn't something you claimed, it was something you proved. Daily, relentlessly. You didn't get to opt out of responsibility. You didn't get to outsource survival. If you couldn't produce, build, fix, adapt, or defend, you didn't last. That wasn't cruelty. That was reality. Independence was never clean. It wasn't efficient. It didn't come with guarantees. It was raw, unpredictable, and unforgiving. But it created something modern systems struggle to produce: resilience. People understood consequences because they lived them. They understood limits because they hit them. And they understood value because they had to create it themselves. Now compare that to today. Survival isn't tied to capability anymore. It's tied to access. Access to systems. Access to infrastructure. Access to networks you don't control and can't replicate on your own. You don't need to know how things work, you just need to know how to access them. That shift didn't just change how people live, it changed how people think. Because when survival depends on access instead of ability, independence becomes optional, and dependence becomes normalized. And once dependence becomes normal, it stops being questioned. That's where we are. This isn't a story about decline, it's a story about replacement. Independence didn't weaken, it was systematically substituted with something more predictable, more manageable, and more controllable: dependence. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. Section 1. Independence was never comfortable, and that was the point. Independence wasn't designed to feel good. It wasn't supposed to be easy. It required constant decision-making, constant problem-solving, and constant accountability. If something failed, it was your responsibility. If something succeeded, it was your result. That level of ownership creates pressure, but it also creates clarity. You know exactly where you stand because there's no system buffering you from reality. You either produce or you don't. You either adapt or you fall behind. Modern life removed that clarity. It replaced it with layers of abstraction. You can fail without feeling it immediately. You can make poor decisions and still maintain stability for a while. Systems absorb the impact, delay the consequences, and redistribute the risk. On the surface, that looks like progress, but what it really does is disconnect people from cause and effect. And when that connection weakens, so does accountability. Independence required facing reality directly. Dependence filters it. Section 2. The transition didn't happen by accident. Mass behavioral shifts don't just happen. They're guided, nudged, reinforced over time until they feel natural. The move from independence to dependence wasn't a single event, it was a process. A long, gradual restructuring of incentives. Systems were built to reward reliance and discourage self-sufficiency, not by force, but by design. It started with convenience, then expanded through infrastructure, then solidified through economic structures. Each layer made dependence more practical and independence less viable. And here's the key. Most people participated willingly, because at every step, the trade seemed reasonable. A little less effort for a little more comfort. A little less responsibility for a little more security.
No one notices the shift when it's incremental. But over time, those increments compound, and suddenly the baseline has changed. Section 3. When you lose skills, you lose options. Skills are more than abilities. They're leverage. They give you options. They give you flexibility. They give you the ability to operate outside of systems when necessary. When those skills disappear, so do those options. Generations ago, people knew how to grow food, repair structures, maintain tools, manage resources, and solve problems without external input. Those weren't specialized skills. They were standard. Today, many of those capabilities are rare, not because they're obsolete, but because they're no longer required for daily survival within the system. But that within the system part matters, because the moment the system falters, the absence of those skills becomes visible, and by then, it's not something you can fix overnight. Skill loss isn't just cultural, it's structural. It reduces independence at the individual level, which increases dependence at the societal level, and that shift compounds over time. Section 4. Economic structure as a control mechanism. Modern economies are built on participation, continuous, predictable participation. You earn, you spend, you repeat. That cycle isn't just economic, it's behavioral. True independence disrupts that cycle. It introduces unpredictability. People who can operate outside the system don't contribute to it in the same way, and that creates instability from a system perspective. So the structure evolved to make independence less practical. Stable income requires system participation. Access to resources requires system integration. Long-term planning requires system alignment. Every major pathway loops back into centralized structures. And then there's debt. That isn't just financial, it's behavioral. It anchors individuals to future obligations that require ongoing participation. It reduces mobility. It limits options. It reinforces dependence. You don't need force when obligation does the work for you. Section 5. Security was the selling point. Dependence doesn't sell itself as weakness, it sells itself as protection, safety, stability, reliability. These are powerful motivators. People don't just want to survive, they want predictability. They want assurance that tomorrow will function like today. Systems offer that assurance. But here's the trade-off. The more security a system provides, the more control it requires to maintain that security. Because stability doesn't happen automatically, it's managed. And management requires authority. So every layer of security comes with an equivalent layer of oversight. It may not feel restrictive at first, but it sets the boundaries of operation. And over time, those boundaries tighten.
Section 6. Community shifted from local to structural. Independence never meant isolation. It meant operating within smaller, decentralized networks. Families, neighbors, people you actually knew. If something broke, you didn't file a request, you fixed it together. If someone struggled, the response wasn't paperwork, it was immediate, human, and direct. These communities weren't perfect, but they were responsive. They were alive. That structure created a kind of independence that still allowed support. You weren't dependent on a distant authority. You were interdependent with people who had a shared stake in survival. Accountability was local. Trust was earned face to face. And because of that, systems didn't need to be massive to function. They needed to be real. That model didn't scale well, and that's exactly why it was replaced. Centralized systems took over because they could standardize, regulate, and expand. Efficiency increased, output increased. But something critical was lost in the process. Adaptability. Local communities can pivot instantly because they're close to the problem. Centralized systems respond through layers, protocols, and delays. And that distance creates fragility, because when the system becomes the primary source of support, and that system slows down or fails, there's no immediate fallback. The local network that once absorbed those shocks is gone, or too weak to respond. Dependence thrives in that gap. Section 7. Failure was rebranded as something to avoid at all costs.
Failure used to be part of the process, not optional, necessary. You didn't learn by being guided perfectly. You learned by getting it wrong, adjusting, and trying again. That's how capability was built. That's how confidence was earned. Now, failure is treated like something that should be eliminated entirely. Systems are designed to reduce friction, prevent mistakes, and guide outcomes toward success. On the surface, that seems like progress. And in some ways it is. But underneath, it removes something essential, the ability to operate when things don't go as planned. When failure disappears, so does resilience. People become used to smooth outcomes, predictable results, managed experiences. But real-world conditions aren't always controlled. And when those systems stop compensating, people are left without the experience needed to respond. It's not that they're incapable, it's that they've never been required to be capable under pressure. And that difference matters. Because resilience isn't theoretical, it's practiced. Remove the practice, and you remove the resilience. Section 8. Identity was externalized. Independence builds identity from the inside out. It's based on what you can do, what you can handle, what you can create. It's grounded in capability. You don't need validation, you have evidence. Dependence shifts that foundation outward. Now identity is tied to roles within systems, job titles, affiliations, online presence, social feedback. It's not about what you can build, it's about where you fit and how you're perceived. That shift changes behavior. Because when identity comes from external systems, those systems gain influence over how people see themselves. Approval becomes currency, visibility becomes value, and alignment with the system becomes necessary to maintain that identity. That's not independence, that's dependency at the psychological level.
And it's powerful because people will protect their identity even when it limits their autonomy. Section 9. Choice exists, but only within structure. One of the most effective ways to maintain dependence is to preserve the illusion of independence, and the easiest way to do that is through controlled choice. People can choose careers, products, opinions, lifestyles, but all within predefined systems. You can pick your path, but the paths are already built. You can make decisions, but only within the available framework. That creates a powerful perception, freedom, but it's bounded. True independence includes the ability to step outside the system, to operate without relying on it. That ability is increasingly limited, not removed entirely, but restricted enough that most people never attempt it. Because why would they? The system works, it provides, it responds, until it doesn't. And when that moment comes, the boundaries become visible. Section 10. Dependence is self-reinforcing. Dependence doesn't just exist, it grows. The more people rely on systems, the less they develop independent capabilities. And the less they develop those capabilities, the more they rely on systems. That's the loop. It feeds itself. You don't need to enforce dependence when it becomes the easier option. People choose it, not because they're weak, but because the system is designed to make that choice logical. Why struggle when a system can do it for you? Why learn when access is easier? Why build when you can obtain? Each of those decisions makes sense in isolation, but together they shift the entire structure of society, from self-sufficient individuals to system-reliant participants. Section 11. The cost isn't immediate, and that's why it's ignored. Dependence doesn't fail right away. That's what makes it so effective. It delivers results. It creates stability. It functions well enough that people trust it until they have no reason not to. The cost shows up slowly, in reduced adaptability, in reduced problem-solving ability, in reduced tolerance for disruption. But those reductions are subtle. They don't trigger alarms, they don't feel urgent, so they're ignored, until something breaks. And when it does, the gap between dependence and independence becomes obvious, not as a theory, but as a limitation people can't work around. That's when the real cost shows up, and by then, rebuilding what was lost isn't quick. Section 12. Breaking dependence requires reconstruction, not rejection. You can't just walk away from modern systems. That's not realistic. The infrastructure is too embedded. The economy is too integrated. Daily life is too connected. But dependence isn't all or nothing. It's layered, and those layers can be adjusted. Rebuilding independence doesn't mean rejecting systems entirely. It means reducing reliance where possible, relearning skills that were lost, understanding how things work instead of just how to access them, creating alternatives, even small ones. It's not dramatic, it's not fast, but it's real, because independence today doesn't look like it did in the past. It exists in pieces, in choices, in awareness, and those pieces still matter.
In closing, dependence didn't arrive with warning signs. It didn't feel like control. It felt like progress, like things were getting easier, faster, more stable, more predictable, and in many ways they did. But every layer of convenience came with a trade-off. Every system that simplified life also reshaped it. And over time, those systems didn't just support how people lived, they defined it. That's where the shift became permanent. Because once systems define your access to food, money, communication, healthcare, information, once they define how you work, how you move, how you connect, you're no longer operating independently, you're operating within a framework you didn't build, a framework you don't control, a framework that can change without your input. And that's the part most people avoid thinking about, because the system works until it doesn't. And when it stops working, whether partially or completely, the question isn't whether help is coming. The question is whether you can function without it. For most people, the answer is uncomfortable, because independence wasn't just reduced, it was replaced. Replaced with convenience, replaced with structure, replaced with systems that feel permanent until they're not. That's the reality. Not collapse, not chaos. Design. A system that doesn't need force because it doesn't face resistance. A population that doesn't need control because it operates within the boundaries already set. That's where things stand. And from here, there are only two directions. Deeper dependence or deliberate reconstruction of independence. Piece by piece, decision by decision. No reset button. No dramatic escape. Just awareness, followed by choice. And whether that choice gets made, that's the part no system can decide for you.
That's where we're going to leave this one. Dependence didn't just happen. It was built, reinforced, and normalized until most people stopped even recognizing it. And once something becomes normal, it stops being questioned, even when it should be. The uncomfortable part is this. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start noticing where the reliance is, how deep it goes, and how hard it actually is to step outside of it. Not impossible, but definitely not easy. And that leads us right into the next episode, Episode 8, Information Overload, Understanding Nothing. Because it's not just about dependence on systems, it's about what happens when you're flooded with so much information that clarity disappears entirely. When knowing more somehow leads to understanding less. If this episode hit something for you, don't just scroll past it. Sit with it. Think about it. And if you're following the series, Episode 8 is going to connect dots that most people don't even realize are there. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. This is The Things That Bother Me. Until next time.